Hello.
Hello. How's everybody doing?
Good, how are you?
I'm doing all right. It's been a long day. Can't think of a better way to finish it up than hang out with you guys, right? It's cool. Lucky dude. How's the end of this semester going?
Long.
Long. Yeah. We got one more week. We're almost there. I was opening up our lecture, our PowerPoints, and that clown picture popped up. I was like, that's horrifying. Unnecessary. I don't know, I don't know who the Joker was who put that on there. All right. Well, we'll give people maybe a couple more minutes, but then if we don't get anybody, we'll just uh, let the two of you run the show. Oh, there we go. All right. We'll call this a quorum and then jump off from here. So, questions people have for um, on this last material.
So I had a question. It talks about in like module 20 or 44 in the book, it talks about aversive conditioning. And we kind of talked about that before, but wasn't like one of the main limitations that like people associate like the medicine that makes you feel sick with the alcohol and not the alcohol itself, so it doesn't have a high rate of like recovery for people using that type of method?
Yeah. So the issue with aversion disorders is, and this is an interesting question about, if behaviorism accounted for everything, right? If behaviorism was the full and sum of factors impacting behavior, because we as human beings are so quick to pair taste with feelings of nausea and illness, then if I'm taking a medication that anytime I drink alcohol, it's going to make me violently ill. Behaviorism says that should extinguish that behavior very quickly, right? Um, Problem is it doesn't work, right? And if we think about just excessive alcohol use on its own, right? I don't no one has to give a testimonial, but sometimes people drink a lot and they get violently ill and say, I will never drink that much again. I'm done. I'm never drinking again. And that almost is never the case, right? And so the question is what are the other things that continue and perpetuate alcohol use that sort of overpowers taste aversion stuff? And so those aversion therapies work okay. As long as you're taking the medication. If I'm taking antabuse, it's going to keep me from drinking because as soon as I drink, I'm going to get violently ill. Um, and so as long as I take that as a prophylactic, I'm probably not going to drink. But if I really want to tie one on, I'm just going to not take the antabuse and then I'm going to go get drunk, right? And so that's really the thing. They were pretty effective as long as people take them, because physically I can't drink alcohol without being violently ill. It's also up to me on whether or not I want to take it. And so if I really want to have a drink, I just won't take it. And sort of then it's not as effective. And so that's some of the stuff. I mean, you got with some opiate use disorders, same thing like Suboxone is supposed to limit the impact. So if I'm taking that and then take sort of an opiate on top of it, it should sort of not have the same effect because there's stuff that sort of impacts that. And so there's some really cool, if you ever have an opportunity to take a course in psychopharmacology, really, really interesting stuff. It's just that there's more to some of these mental health stuff than just sort of biological stuff and brain stuff. Anytime you start hearing something that's too much brain stuff in terms of complex mental health stuff, you should start to be a little bit skeptical of that. So does that help sort of clear up some of the limitations of those aversion therapies?
Yeah, that helps a lot. Thank you.
Okay, cool. Other questions on any of this stuff?
So when you're looking at like the differences between like cognitive and like cognitive behavioral therapy, is it like mainly that cognitive behavioral, like you try to like work differently from your thinking, but like you also put it to action, so it's not just like the reinforcement of positive thinking, but it's like using that action as well?
Yeah, that's a good question. And so this is so with our evidence-based treatments and like clinical science is often sort of heavily dominated by cognitive behavioral perspective. And it's a perspective I was trained in, and so that's sort of what I feel most comfortable with. If we're doing this, if we're talking about something like let's say accident related PTSD, right? So I get in a car accident and I sort of now have problems with anxiety with driving and sort of memories and things like that, right? If I wanted to take a purely cognitive approach to that, what we might do is start asking people to talk about sort of what their beliefs are about driving, sort of their estimations of how dangerous it is, sort of identifying some problematic ways of thinking about sort of the potential consequences if I'm driving and sort of evaluate those, looking at evidence for or against, and sort of saying, okay, this is just a thought. Thoughts are just thoughts. They don't have to actually sort of mean anything. And sort of thinking about how we're thinking about things. That would be a purely cognitive approach. But I could also take a purely behavioral approach. I could ask you, what we find is sometimes thinking about our thoughts is a hard thing for some people to do, right? If Sailor, if you're angry and I say, Sailor, why are you angry? I don't know, I'm angry. What are you thinking? I'm thinking I'm angry. Well, angry is an emotion. Like, what are you actually thinking, right? And so maybe it's that sort of Cade said something rude to you and then you were mad at Cade. I don't know, right? But for some people, that's a hard thing to say. Okay, Cade said this. I interpreted to mean this, which then caused me to become angry. And if we're doing a cognitive approach, we would say, okay, so did Cade really mean that? Like, are there other explanations for why he said what he said? Even if Cade did mean that, do you really care what Cade thinks? Those types of things to help try and take the heat off of some of that emotion. But this is a hard thing for people to do sometimes, right? It's that metacognition is a hard thing. And so what we have also are behavioral interventions, right? And so going back to, let's say, the driving anxiety, what I might do is say, all right, Sailor, what I want you to do is start driving around your neighborhood, or maybe even it's just sitting in your car. Maybe sitting in your car, just that alone will get you to almost having a panic attack. So what I'm going to say is I'm going to say, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to have you sit in the car, and I want you to sit in that car. I don't want you to escape. I want you to sit in that car until your anxiety comes down. It might take a while, but we're just not built to be perpetually in a state of intense fear indefinitely. If you stay there, eventually it's going to go down. And so maybe we start with you sitting in the car, and maybe then we have you turn the car on and sit there a little bit, right, while the car is running. Then maybe we have you sort of drive around your block, right, and sort of increasingly go out. At no point in any of those exercises do I need to ask you to think about your thoughts. I'm just having you do it, right? And what we're seeing there with that straight behavioral exercise, you start to habituate to the anxiety. Your body starts to learn that sort of, hey, this doesn't necessarily have to be unsafe or things like that. And so it starts to come down. Usually what we do is we do these hand in hand. There's sort of multiple pathways. Either one of those will work. We're just going through and sort of allowing you to sort of take one way or the other. And so the cognitive behavioral stuff is generally sort of joined hand in hand. We have some pieces of it that are more behavioral in nature, some pieces are more cognitive, but generally it's a combination of the two. Does that help sort of clarify that distinction?
Yeah, it did. Thank you.
Other questions?
I had a question about the categorical versus the continuous and like
Yeah.
the DX threshold, and I was confused on that.
Yeah. Elijah, what specific, I mean, is just kind of understanding what we're talking about there?
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay, cool. That is a great question. Let me go through and oops. Sort of pop this in. All right. So, Elijah, what we generally see when we're talking about, if I'm talking about PTSD or I'm talking about depression or alcohol use or something along those lines, with the way we set up diagnoses, we usually talk about that as either you have it or you don't, right? Either I meet criteria for depression, I don't. I meet criteria for alcohol use disorder, I don't. Talking about these as kind of categorical yes, no things, right? But when we actually look into some of these symptoms, almost all of the things that we look at are probably better accounted for on some type of continuum. Okay. I can go from not drinking at all to drinking a handle of vodka a day and not having a job or being able to maintain relationships or work, right? Those are two very opposite ends of the spectrum. Obviously, one person doesn't have an alcohol use disorder, the other person does, right? But if we're looking at stuff, right, what we do is we set up some sort of threshold. And once you cross this line, we say you have a disorder. If you're on the other side, we say you don't. But really what happens is we see things kind of existing on this continuum, right? So if we're looking at, again, we talked about in class, we have someone who's perfectly fine and happy and has never had a depressive episode in their life, then they obviously have no depression. If they can't get out of bed, they can't eat, and they can't maintain employment, or sort of they're failing out of school because of their struggles with depression, then that's very clearly depression, right? But what we get is these people hanging out right here on these edges, right? I could have someone who just falls short of meeting criteria for depression. So if I say, is this person meet criteria for depression? I say no, right? But that doesn't mean that person doesn't have symptoms or that they're not struggling a great deal, right? And I might have someone else who just falls on the other side of the line, who does meet criteria for depression, who's actually overall functioning quite a bit better than the person who doesn't meet criteria for depression. That person who doesn't meet criteria for depression is maybe just missing one symptom or something along those lines, right? And so we talk about these as categorically different things, when in fact it's sort of better thought of on a continuum, right? And so most of our, with few exceptions, most of our mental health diagnoses are probably better thought about in terms of this continuum of difficulties, as opposed to either you have it or you don't. Sort of these two are categorically different in kind, versus some sort of continuum. Does that help kind of clarify that a little bit?
Yeah, it does.
Cool. Good question. Other questions?
I have a question on module 44, and with like the gold standard and stuff, you were talking about efficacy versus effectiveness.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just a little confused on that, I guess.
Yeah, no, that's a good question, Abigail. The issue is if I have evidence of an efficacious study, what that means is if I, in the perfect world of my laboratory settings with all the resources I have available to me, if it's me, it's not many, but like sort of hypothetically, if we're working with people who have big, high-powered research labs, right? Like I can bring people in and I can get movement in symptoms if people are adhering to this protocol, if they're coming in and doing things like that, right? So these RCTs that we talked about, these are often sort of geared towards efficacy, right? It means that these will work sort of within sort of this limited parameters, right? Effectiveness says, okay, we have evidence that this treatment works, right? And it looks like it works if we have a pretty clean sample. Let's say I'm looking at OCD, right? I've got people who are not taking medications and able to come in for treatment and don't have other comorbidities and don't have personality related issues or all those other things, right? So we can see that, yeah, for these folks, we start to get a movement in symptoms. Effectiveness is this transportable? If I go throughout and if I pull out all the maybe pretty restrictive inclusion criteria, do we go through and do we get people coming in? And is anybody else hearing that, or is that just me?
I'm hearing it too.
Yeah, I don't know.
Hearing what?
What's up?
Hearing what?
Hey, can you hit your mute button for a hot minute?
Sure.
Okay. Cade, that might have been you. It sounded like sort of airplanes flying around on my end of thing.
Oh, I think I know what that might be. I think it's my heater that's doing that. I'll mute myself.
Okay, awesome. I was like, so the choppers are coming in. All right, sorry. So get it back where we're at, Abigail. So effectiveness is going through and saying, does this intervention work in sort of a more naturalistic setting, right? So if we sort of cut down and just say, hey, if you meet criteria for depression, we're going to give you this treatment, right? And sort of starting to look at, and can other people replicate this outside of sort of, I'm the developer and in my pristine lab, we can get this to work. If Sailor does this and she's a provider out in the community, we have multi-site things. So these are more effectiveness questions, right? So getting out of, for the science, is this effective? Is this efficacious? And into, is this something that will likely be helpful sort of broadly in terms of stuff? Okay, so that's the difference between the two. The effectiveness studies are meant to address some of the concerns with generalizability and the ecological validity that we have with the RCTs. RCTs are great and RCTs are important. They're still our gold standard, but they leave some questions in terms of, okay, if I'm Joe clinician out in the universe and these are the people who I'm seeing who have PTSD, I can't say, well, you've got other stuff going on, so I'm not going to treat you. No, I'm going to say, like, you have PTSD plus depression and you're drinking heavily and some other stuff. Does this treatment still work for you? As opposed to sort of the cleaner RCT samples that they try and get. Other stuff.
Could you kind of go over again, like the biological theories for like why people have like bipolar disorder?
Yeah. So, okay. So for our bipolar disorders, okay, this is one of those conditions, Elijah, that looks like it's probably not existing on a continuum. Okay. For, let's say, something like depression, right? If you get enough strain and loss and sort of hardship time and time again, eventually you could, even if you're not prone to it, you could develop a depressive episode just because, with enough external stress, it could generate a depressive episode, right? But for things like bipolar disorder or schizophrenia, probably no amount of stuff that I could do to you, and I wouldn't, but sort of if like, there's no sort of, it's hard to imagine a sort of external circumstances that would throw you into a manic episode if you didn't already have sort of the biological vulnerability to have that. And so when we're talking about that continuum approach for things like depression and anxiety, alcohol use disorder, things along those lines, that continuum works pretty well. If we're talking about bipolar disorders, though, this looks to be a little bit categorical, right? And so remember that the main feature of, or the main characteristic of bipolar disorder are these manic symptoms. I can have bipolar disorder and never have a depressive episode, right? It's all based on the mania. And so, and we also see that heritability for bipolar disorder is some of the highest levels of heritability we see for any disorder. High is 85%. So this is huge familial risk for bipolar as a condition. And so a lot of these theories are based on sort of biological mechanisms. So say that this, the circadian rhythm hypotheses, from this perspective, we're thinking about bipolar as a condition of extremes, right? Where people have both very highs and very lows, right? And so this idea is that, perhaps for most of us, there are sort of things out in our environment that help us regulate our mood, right? They keep us from getting too high, they keep us from getting too low. And the idea behind the circadian rhythm hypothesis is that sort of whatever those things are have gone haywire for people who struggle with bipolar symptoms, okay? So those things that keep me from going through the roof and trying to sell my house, or going out and taking a bunch of drugs and getting in fights with people, or deciding I'm going to start my own business or sort of buy a new car, that stuff is gone for me. And so what I do is I creep up into those things that keep me leveled out are gone, and so or disrupted, so I can get too high. Same thing, the things that keep me from getting so low that I can't get out of bed and I can't bathe or sort of function or go to work or do the things I need to do, those things that keep me from getting too low are thrown out of whack. And so these zeitgebers, these things that out in our environment, again, remember we talk about circadian rhythms, like sleep-wake cycle, right? Light is our zeitgeber. If you put me in a dimly lit room with sort of 24 hours a day, same dimly lit stuff, my sleep-wake cycles can get all thrown off, right? Same type of thing. It's something, the idea that maybe something is going on for people with bipolar, those natural circadian rhythms that sort of may or are thought to maybe regulate mood sort of get thrown out of whack. Okay. And so this is a way to try and understand sort of why we have both highs and lows within the context of this disorder. The engagement dysregulation hypothesis piece of things. We know from, and so this is something that's pretty well established from a neuroscience perspective, that we have certain pathways in our brain that seem to be active in working on reward and goal-directed behavior, right? So if I sort of set you up in a brain scanner and I continuously reinforce you with money or cocaine or something else that's just intensely reinforcing for organisms, what we'll see is certain neural paths will sort of light up. So these and we talk about these as reward systems. The idea is that with this engagement dysregulation is that these things that generally regulate reward have kind of gotten out of whack. And so people are too responsive to a reward. And so I'm outgoing and doing sort of too much and sort of being too high, using this as sort of something maybe about those neural paths are sort of disrupted that are not allowing people to regulate. So different than the circadian rhythm approach. This is sort of based on some neural paths. And then the kindling hypothesis is a little bit different, but relevant to bipolar disorder. What we see is individuals who have an initial episode of mania. With each initial episode of mania, the likelihood of having additional episodes of mania increase, and sort of the duration and severity tends to get, looks like it tends to get more severe with increasing episodes. And so the idea here is this is a hypothesis that's based out of some research with epilepsy seizure disorders, right? If I've had an initial seizure, my threshold for having additional seizures gets to be dropped, sort of like kindling, right? It sort of put small logs in the fire, sort of get things going, and then it sort of creates sort of bigger and bigger stuff, right? So the idea is that maybe those initial episodes of mania start to lower the threshold for me, whatever it is that kicks me into subsequent episodes, sort of kicks back up. And so taking sort of this idea from epilepsy research and saying maybe there's something similar going on with these episodes of mania where people, once I have 1 or 2 or 3, and now sort of my threshold for falling into additional episodes starts to become quite low. Any other questions with sort of these bipolar theories, anything like that? Other stuff.
So,
You go for it.
like when someone's in like a manic episode, do they have to be like, I know you said like sometimes they'll like hear voices or they'll think like they need to do that. Is that like something that has to happen, or can they just be like on an extreme high where they're like extremely reckless, but they don't like hear people telling them to do things?
Yeah. Yeah, the psychotic features and so from a clinical standpoint, if I'm talking about psychotic symptoms, it doesn't mean like I'm a axe murderer or something like that. It means I'm experiencing delusions or hallucinations. I'm seeing things that aren't there. I'm thinking things that aren't real. Those tend to be, we see those in more extreme cases, more severe cases, but they're not required. We can have sort of excessive goal-oriented behaviors, pressured speech, real high, really sort of high affect and things like that, right? So those are all things that can go. So now, and when we get into, if you're interested in this stuff, if you ever take an abnormal psychology class, we'll probably talk about, so we're talking about bipolar 1 here. There's also bipolar 2. Bipolar 2 is like bipolar 1. It's just we don't have manic episodes. People don't meet criteria for mania, but they're having kind of lower level, sort of like mini manic symptoms, right? They're not necessarily causing impairment, right? But I'm seeing a clear departure from where I was before. I have some highs and I will have some highs, but it's not to the point where I'm causing problems with my sort of work, school, job, relationships, things along those lines that we see sometimes with mania. So maybe I decide that, I'm going to, over the course of a couple of days, what I've decided to do is I'm done being a professor. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start a contracting company, even though I have no idea what I'm doing with a contracting company, right? Like I don't own a business. I've never owned a business, but I get in my head that I'm going to do this. And so what I start doing is I send in my letter of resignation to the university because I'm done with this. And so what I'm going to do is I'm sort of buying tools that I'm going to do with my contracting companies. And I'm talking to my friends about this thing that I'm doing. I'm very, very, very pressured. And like, so that's not a delusion. I mean, like a professor could quit their job and develop and start a contracting company. It's just, if I were to do that, someone should be concerned sort of with my behavior, because I like being a professional. I like sort of working with you guys. I also like building things, but that's not a career choice where I should say, okay, I'm done with this and go on to do these other things, right? And so, that might be a situation where I have done impairment because I need to make money and I need to sort of keep a job and things like that. And if this manic episode has gone through and caused me some problems and I've racked up a bunch of debt, so those hallucinations, delusions aren't present, right? I guess technically this thing that I'm doing could be a real thing, but it's a symptom of mania, right? So when you see sort of these classic episodes, sometimes it's hard to distinguish between sort of mania and like schizophrenia, like psychosis types of things, right? But with the mania, it's oftentimes a lot of energy, pressure, and things along those lines that look to be characteristic of that. Yeah, Keely.
So if someone's experiencing a severe mania episode, could that later transition into the disorder of schizophrenia?
Boy, that starts to get into a tricky diagnostic piece of things, right? Like, do we call this mania, or do we call this depression or bipolar disorder? These are separate diagnoses, and really, when I ended up cutting out schizophrenia out of our lectures here, just because I wanted to talk with you guys and have people know more about treatments and how to sort of be good consumers and stuff like that. The thing when we think about schizophrenia, people tend to think about schizophrenia in terms of what we would call positive symptoms, right? So the hallucinations, the delusions, sort of the active types of things. Really, the core features, and so many will argue the core features of schizophrenia are what we call negative symptoms. Okay, and this is avolition. So like I'm not sort of motivated to do things. Flattened affect. I don't sort of have any expressive behaviors. I can't take care of myself. Sort of, and these types, so I'm detached from other people and things like that. And it's really these negative symptoms that are really kind of the core feature of schizophrenia, and the things that are really hard. These are the things that cause impairment, right? If tomorrow you wake up and start telling people that you're a messenger from God and that the CIA has planted sort of something in your brain, we have antipsychotics that will probably sort of take some of that down. But the negative symptoms are really hard to treat. And so that's why when we're looking and seeing such high rates of serious mental illness in people who are homeless, if I can't express emotion, if I can't interact with people, if I can't sort of move around and sort of do things that are sort of necessary to hold down a job and rent and things like that, I'm going to be on the street, right? And so when we're thinking about so the difference between bipolar disorder and schizophrenia, kind of a tricky thing. We have to get a long history and get trajectories and timelines and things like that. But probably what wouldn't happen was like, oh, I have bipolar, have mania, and then that launches me into schizophrenia. This is one of these things where we start to see pretty specific genetic transmission of bipolar disorder and schizophrenia based on twin studies and things like that. So we'd think about those probably as better as separate conditions. Yeah, but your head's in the right place in terms of thinking about some of this stuff. Other questions?
Could you explain why, like, the United States tends to have more depression than like other cultures?
Yeah, boy, Abigail, if I knew what the answer to that was, I would be a more famous person than I was, and I would sort of be making more money, and people would like me more. We don't know, and that's a really cool area. So we're looking at sort of some cross-cultural psychology issues, right? And people have brought up sort of good questions back. Oh, well, maybe we just sort of underdiagnose it in sort of non-Western cultures. That doesn't really seem to be the case, right? I mean, there are hypotheses that there's something about, individualistic cultures of the West that sort of may lead people closer to negative evaluations of the self, some unrealistic expectations about what constitutes sort of happiness, some of these types of things, some newer types of what we call third wave cognitive behavioral therapies, sort of based on a lot of sort of Eastern philosophy and tradition, sort of this idea that, we have to be happy all the time. And if I'm not happy all the time, then there's something wrong with me. Well, that's problematic. So if I'm happy all the time, I've got something else going on. I probably have sort of manic issue happening, right? So this idea that, sometimes things are hard and sometimes things are disappointing, but that's fine. We can be disappointed, but not have that sort of define me as a person, sort of that disappointment. This is just a thing that's temporary that I'm experiencing right now, and it won't sort of last. And so sort of this kind of cultural worldview, philosophy type of thing versus what we see sort of on social media and sort of TV and stuff like that, where I have to be the best. And if I'm not the best or having as much fun as everybody else or not as have all the things that other people have, then I'm feeling sort of negative thoughts about myself. And then I'm feeling sort of I'm not as good as other people and then I'm a failure. Other people are happier than me and I'm not happy all the time. And so that means there's something wrong with me. I'm a flawed individual. Things will never work out for me. And sort of the idea that sort of some of the things that happen in our individualistic societies may sort of lead people towards more risk for depressive episodes, as opposed to non-Western cultures that tend to be maybe a little bit more collective. Like I I don't have to be perfect. I'm doing my job. I'm part of something that's sort of bigger than me. Sort of, I define myself more about sort of my role in sort of the whole, as opposed to me as a special flower, who's unique and beautiful in every way. That, that may sort of give people a better buffer for some depressive stuff than maybe in other cultures. And so it's a hypothesis. We don't know exactly what's going on, but the idea being that there's perhaps some cultural issues going there.
And does that kind of relate to like the self-fulfilling prophecy of like how people can like say that they're depressed and stuff?
Yeah, right. And this is the thing with kind of, I think that's a good point when we're talking about labels, right? And the potential side effects of labels, right? Like, so if like I identify myself as, I would say, oh, I'm depressed. Well, it's like, well, then that means that I'm depressed, that I'm sort of somehow worse than other people in some way, or I can't do the things that other people would do because I'm depressed. Well, then I may not try to do the things because particularly if I've identified heavily with this diagnosis of depression, and if I'm not out doing things, then I'm probably not going to be successful in things if I don't ever try. You got to play to win. And so then maybe what happens is I start to look around me and say, hey, other people are doing things and I'm not doing things. And that makes me feel worse, which makes it even less likely for me to go out and do things, which makes the depression worse, which makes it harder to go out. And so we get kind of this feed forward cycle that we see a lot of times with depression and anxiety. And thinking about these are things that maintain the disorder, right? And so that's why with some of these cognitive behavioral interventions, what we try and do is understand sort of those maintaining factors and try and break them up, right? So again, we talked about behavioral activation for depression, right? So what I don't want you to do is I want you to go on a walk. Like, well, it's cold outside. Like, yep, that's fine. Get out, get some exercise, do something, right? Go to lunch with a friend. Will you like it? Probably not as much as you used to, but it's still better than being by yourself. And you're giving yourself opportunities to have positive experience, where if I'm sitting alone by myself in my house, I'm probably not, right? And so trying to break up that feed forward cycle with something very simple, just going out and doing things, can start to find it to be very effective in terms of helping people break out of stuff. Other questions?
I had a question about the harmful dysfunction.
Okay, yeah.
So the points on the first one was like a system fails to perform a biologically intended function. I get that. The second one that says the failure results in harm as judged by the standards of the individual's culture. Could you just kind of explain what that means exactly?
Yeah. And so, I think there are, situations where people will say, depending on sort of what type of thing that I'm experiencing, there may be a cultural issue in there, right? Like, so for example, people will make arguments that, so seeing visions, right? Like, so if, Keely, if you had a friend come up to you and say, hey, I'm seeing visions about this going to happen in the future, you would probably be reasonably concerned for that person, right? Like, that's interesting. Let's figure out what's happening, right? But it's possible that in some cultures, right, there are sort of this idea of like, I see visions or I have experiences that other people don't experience, or perhaps valued in some way, and sort of maybe like something that's problematic in American Western culture may not be problematic in a different culture. Okay. And so the idea with the harmful dysfunction is say, okay, if we have a system that fails to biologically perform a biologically intended function, which has its own issues, but then the failures results in judged and harmed by the standards of the culture. That's what then starts to sort of take this cultural piece, Elijah, and start to consider sort of cultural impacts on how we identify something as problematic or not. Okay. Let's say someone in Western culture comes in and they're say 40 years old and have never lived alone independently in their own home, and they've always lived with their parents and they're 40 years old, right? That would be a strange thing in American culture, right? You all at 1920 might identify friends who are still living with their parents as problematic, right? If we say this is a middle-aged adult man who has never been married and still lives with her parents, that's maybe indicative of something that has gone wrong, right? But in other cultures, right, sort of more collectivist cultures, that may be sort of not strange, actually normative. It's part of the family structure, and that's kind of what we do, right? And so thinking about sort of how this kind of works and thinking about cultural aspects of things and how that might play a role in how we conceptualize disorder or problems. Does that help kind of clarify that a little bit, Elijah?
Yeah, it does. Yeah. You explained the first part a little bit as well.
Yeah,
Try
the
that.
failing to perform a biologically intended function. Okay, so let's say that I have, for let's say depression, right? Like hypothetically, I have an emotion system that should keep me pretty even keeled, right? If bad things happen, I'm going to feel bad. If good things happen, I'm going to feel good. Most of the time, I'm going to feel sort of wherever my baseline is. But my emotion system is, in theory, intended to keep me pretty even, Steven. But if that system goes out of whack, now maybe I'm feeling too low all the time, or maybe I'm struggling with bipolar stuff, right? So I'm way high or way low sometimes, right? And so the argument would be that sort of my emotion system has failed to perform its biologically intended function of keeping me even out, which is an interesting way to think about things. Problem is it's hard to say with any sort of definitive certainty that I have a emotion system that's specifically intended to keep me sort of within certain parameters, right? Maybe, but maybe not, right? Things develop and have sort of advantageous side effects. And so I've got a system that was maybe developed or evolved to do one thing, but it's kind of a side effect. It allows me to do this other thing, which is pretty cool, right? So again, we talked about reading disorder, right? I can be diagnosed with a reading disorder if I have certain symptoms and have difficulty reading some things, right? But do we have a biologically determined system that sort of organizes reading? No, reading is probably an artifact of just higher level cognitive functioning and sort of things that have evolved for other reasons. Reading is just kind of a handy byproduct of all that stuff, which starts to sort of question or poke holes in this assumption that everything that we do, all of our wide range of possible behaviors are based on some biologically intended function, like this system was developed to do specifically this thing, okay? Same type of thing when we're talking about way back, when we're talking about genes, right? And thinking about genetic contributions to complex behaviors, right? Sort of this misunderstanding of genes as like, oh, this gene, like I have an alcohol gene, right? Sort of like, oh, and this is the gene that sort of makes me drink alcohol. Well, probably not. There are genetic correlates of alcohol use disorder, right? For those individuals who struggle with alcohol use disorder, we see on average, certain genes start to pop up, or a certain version of genes start to pop up, but it would probably be a mistake to say these genes were developed and sort of evolved specifically to regulate alcohol use disorder. They probably evolved to regulate a bunch of other stuff. Alcohol, it looks like they might be involved in alcohol use disorder, but like this is my alcoholic gene or this is my alcohol gene is an overly simplistic and not realistic way to think about things. So same thing with sort of this idea or criticism against a biologically intended function of systems. Cool. Other questions? Feeling okay with this stuff? Cool. All right, folks. Well, Well, if anything comes up, you're going through, working through material, always feel free to shoot me an email and say, hey, can you help explain this? Otherwise, quiz 7 will be the same as any other quiz. It's same stuff, same format, no different, except we just need to make sure to take this one. So just make sure you got a good internet connection tomorrow at 11. Go through, do your best job. So just make sure you prep tonight, and then probably most of you all will be done, right? So this will be the last time I see you for this semester, or for sort of however long, unless you happen to walk through my office at home, because this is where I live. This is my prison. Thank you so much, folks, for a great semester. Yeah, let me know if you're running any problems. And sort of once we get scores, I'll go through, post those with projections on, again, one, if you have just the 6 hours, the required 6 hours. Let's say you got 6 hours of research, but you had an unexcused no-show. That's kind of what the first column will be. Other column, if you max out all your extra credit, 9 hours, no missed appointments, that'll be the other one. And then you can kind of gauge kind of where you are between those two extremes with other stuff. Okay. All right. Awesome. Good luck. And yeah, let me know if you run any questions, folks. All right. We'll see you.
Real quick.
Hey, Professor.
Oh, yep.
Was there ever a video for module 45?
For module 45, no, the videos that are posted are the videos that are posted. So just make sure that you go through and read all those modules that are assigned. Have a good handle on that. Elijah, this section, just because this is kind of my area, this is me kind of more freestyling things, and so it's a less maybe tied into the text. So just make sure you got a good handle on the text. That's going to fill in a lot of gaps for the stuff that I've done.
All right, thank you.
Yep. Cool. Kate, did you have a question?
I was just going to say, see you, Professor. Thank you, and have a good night.
All right, we'll see you. Thanks. You have a good night too. Abigail, did you have a question?
Yeah, I have a question. So where are the grades going to be posted after quiz 7, or do we have to email you?
Yeah, what I'll do is I will go through and post again those projected grades. So Abigail, how many research hours do you finish with?
I have 9.
Okay, any missed appointments?
I think 1, but I'm not too sure if I canceled it on time or not.
So, I mean, let me see here. What I will do, I don't have it up. What I'll go through and I'll go through and look at those projections. And if you're way in the clear, you'll be good. If you have questions, because I can't assign people's grades until we hit Friday, and the Friday shuts down. Then we have with Sona closes, and I know sort of what people's final totals are. Then I can go through and sort of calculate actual grades, and I'll send that out. So it'll take a while for people to get grades and everything logged and stuff like that. So probably Monday of finals week, I'll send out an announcement that says, hey, right now, based on your research, this is your grade in my class, right? And you can go through and take a look at that and say, okay, cool, or I don't, sort of maybe I want to take the optional final. Give you an opportunity to go through and sort of make that decision, okay? Yeah, I don't want it to be a surprise, and sort of whenever grades need to be posted, that's when you get your final grade. So I'll send that out. Also, if there's any type of mistake or something like that, or my records don't match up with yours, let me know. So we'll go through, do that. So you'll have a projection probably tomorrow. And then once the semester ends after Friday, I'll go through and post same type of thing, like we always do in those quiz scores, just a spreadsheet. You can find your posting code and take a look at that.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much.
Awesome. All right. I like your tree. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Yeah.